What if the most dangerous people in the world didn't just exploit children? What if their entire system depended on it? Not as an accident, not as a scandal, but as a ritual, a price of admission, a way to create power so absolute, no one inside can ever escape. If you've ever wondered why the people who run the world are so obsessed with gods like Baal and Moloch, weird symbols, secret meetings, and inside jokes that the rest of us aren't in on, this episode is for you. Today we're pulling on a thread that runs from the ancient world straight into the modern boardroom and private jets. We're talking about Baal, Moloch, billionaires, the ruling class, these elites, and the occult mythology of that ruling class. I'm not here to do any tabloid demon hunting or turn every triangle on a dollar bill into some kind of conspiracy. What we're going to do is much more uncomfortable. We're going to ask why so many elite networks organize around ritual, secrecy, and taboo. We're also going to look at how myths of sacrifice, especially the sacrifice of children, keep showing up wherever money and power concentrate. And we're also going to trace how this plays out in the real world through networks like Jeffrey Epstein, and we're going to look at cases like the Franklin Credit Union scandal. By the end of this episode, I want you to see something very clearly. The problem isn't just a few bad apples doing awful things in secret. It's a culture of power that has built a kind of modern religion of Moloch, a religion where human beings, especially the most vulnerable, are treated as fuel for wealth, leverage, and control. Hi friend, welcome back to Radical Leftist Scum. I'm your host, Valdet Selimaj. Let's start by going back, way back, to the myths that gave us Baal and Moloch in the first place. When we talk about Baal and Moloch, we're talking about the ancient Near Eastern deities tied to fertility, harvest, and power. In the biblical and later Jewish and Christian imagination, Moloch became the symbol of the god who demands child sacrifice, which is like the ultimate horror. Now, historians debate the exact historical details, but for our purposes, what matters is the story that's stuck. There's a god of power and prosperity. That god demands the sacrifice of children, and people in charge are willing to offer up their own kids or other people's kids to keep the system running. Fast forward through history, and you see a recurring pattern. Ancient empires with state cults, where rulers were considered semi-divine and surrounded by priests and oracles. We saw medieval courts, where kings and queens wrapped their rule in religious ritual and sometimes in esoteric traditions or alchemy. We also saw secret societies and fraternal orders in early modern Europe and America. These are places where elites blended business, politics, and ritual under the veil of secrecy. A couple of examples are the Freemasons. A lot of people are familiar with them. They're one of the oldest and most prominent, offering a network for social and civic life. There's also Skull and Bones. This was an exclusive elite senior society at Yale University who had a very significant influence. The names and the outfits change over time. The gods get rebranded, but the underlying logic always stays familiar. A small group of people claim a special relationship with power, with destiny, with the way things should be, and they enforce that relationship through rituals, oaths, and taboos. Now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, we like to pretend we've grown out of all that. We talk about markets and democracy, not gods and sacrifices. But look at the behavior, not the branding. We still have inner circles, we still have oaths and secrets, and we still see ruling classes willing to sacrifice children and the future, whether through war, like the genocide in Palestine, austerity, environmental collapse, or, as we'll talk about today, organized abuse and trafficking. So when I bring up Baal and Moloch in 2026, I'm not saying some billionaire literally believes that he's praying to a Canaanite deity, although at this point some do believe that, and it shows. What I'm saying is, this is the archetype we keep recreating. the god of endless consumption, demanding human sacrifice, dressed up in business casual. From here, it's important that we get precise about language, because when people hear Satanism or satanic rituals, a lot of different things get jammed together. Let's separate three things that often get conflated. First, there's modern religious or philosophical Satanism. So for example, like maybe you've heard of the Church of Satan or the Satanic Temple. I'm part of the Satanic Temple. These are real organizations with public doctrines. However, keep in mind, many of them are explicitly atheist or symbolic, and they use Satan as a metaphor for rebellion against authoritarian religion. So in other words, they are the anti-religion religion. Then we have number two, pop culture satanic panic. Some of you might remember this. In the 1980s and 90s, there were waves of fear about hidden satanic cults supposedly everywhere, which led to some false accusations and moral hysteria. And then the third one is the use of satanic or inverted religious imagery in elite abuse networks. So like that's where the goal isn't really coherent theology, but more shock, domination, and binding people into a crime family. Now, our focus today is that third category. So when we talk about satanic cults in the context of ruling class behavior, what we're talking about is the inversion of the sacred, so taking what is considered most innocent or holy, children, sexuality, the body, trust, and turning it into a stage for cruelty. Then we have ritual as technology, so using repeated, choreographed acts to create a sense of destiny, to blur guilt among participants, and to make backing out feel like it's impossible. And then we have symbolism as camouflage and glue. These are the robes, the symbols, the Latin phrases, the inverted crosses. All of that can be used to create a feeling of belonging and to signal to insiders you're part of something bigger than law or morality. So yes, there are people who call themselves Satanists, and they would be horrified by child abuse or trafficking. Satanists don't practice those things. But it is also true that some real abuse networks have used satanic or occult imagery precisely because it is so taboo, so charged, and so effective at binding victims and perpetrators into secrecy. And that leads us into the conversation of satanic ritual abuse. Satanic ritual abuse, it's also known as SRA, is one of those phrases that makes people's guard go up, and for good reason. On one hand, the 80s and 90s are full of some discredited cases, junk psychology, cops, therapists who saw devils in everyday daycare, music videos. A lot of innocent people had their lives destroyed by bad investigations and collective panic. But on the other hand, it is also true that organized, ritualized abuse exists. Survivors describe repeated abuse in group settings, surrounded by symbols, costumes, chants, or staged ceremonies. There are documented cases where police, politicians, clergy, and wealthy figures were implicated, and where investigations were quietly shut down, evidence went missing, or witnesses were discredited. In some cases, also mysteriously died. So how do we hold both truths? Well, we have to do it by being specific. We focus on structures of power, like who has the money, which is something that the survivors of Epstein have been saying for a while now, follow the money. We also look at the access and the institutional control to run and protect such a network. In that light, SRA stops looking like a wild, supernatural story and starts looking like a very dark technology of control and blackmail. You bring people, especially powerful people, into acts that are utterly indefensible. You surround those acts with ritual and symbolism that tells them you've crossed a line you can never uncross. You now own them, and they know it. This is where we transition from abstract talk of rituals to the hard edge of material reality, trafficking, assault, and in some cases, allegations of cannibalism, and extreme degradation used to fully break victims down. We're going to talk about these practices in broad terms without real graphic detail because the point isn't shock value. The point is to understand why elites keep ending up here. So we need to start with a conversation about Jeffrey Epstein, not as a lone monster, but as a node in a larger system. So here's what we know. Epstein operated a global network of trafficking and abuse with properties in multiple countries, private jets, and a constant flow of vulnerable young people and children. He cultivated relationships with billionaires, politicians, royalty, academics, and intelligence-connected figures. There is strong evidence that what he ran was not just abuse for personal gratification, but a kind of blackmail and leverage machine. So why would people at that level get involved with something so extreme and so obviously evil? Because from the twisted perspective of power, these practices work on several levels. Maximum taboo means maximum control. The more unthinkable the crime, the more certain you can be that people will do anything to keep it hidden. And if everyone in the room is guilty of something unspeakable, no one can safely turn on the others. Then we have total moral compromise. Once someone has crossed certain lines, they may feel they no longer deserve redemption or public life outside the network, and that despair can actually make them more loyal and more dangerous. And then there's also a sense of being above ordinary humans. Engaging in acts that everyone else would consider monstrous becomes, in their warped self-image, proof that they are beyond normal morality. And this is where the old gods come back in. The idea that they are some priests of a higher law of power and sacrifice. When you add cannibalism into the mix, which appears in some allegations and testimonies, the symbolism becomes almost too on the nose. A class that already consumes the world economically also plays with literal images of consuming human flesh, especially that of the young and the powerless. Again, we don't need to prove every story or every rumor to see the pattern. Child trafficking and extreme degradation are used as tools of blackmail, entertainment, and spiritual theater for people who have lost any connection to ordinary human empathy. The rituals, the symbols, the references to dark gods or Satan, those become the aesthetic of a ruling class that sees itself as beyond judgment. And this is where Baal and Moloch stop being abstract history and start looking eerily familiar. For me, the burning question that's been plaguing my mind is why? Why do they practice these occult behavior, these occult beliefs? Why do they harm children, SA children? Why do they eat children? Why do they bring Baal and Moloch into this current present day reality with billionaires and modern finance? We have these old gods. And I often wonder, why don't they just pray to God? Why this? Why don't they just pray to, and I don't believe in God, but I'm just like thinking out loud. What people don't realize is that Christianity and Catholicism are also technically occult practices, but we've accepted them as part of society. I mean, think about it. They eat the flesh of Jesus, they drink his blood, they pray and chant. Those are all examples of occult practices. But what I've learned, I've been just kind of reading and going into it, and a pattern has emerged about why they choose Moloch or these occult practices versus the more acceptable ones. It's about magic. Not magic like magicians or even witches. It's something deeper. It's like a cross between spirituality, but also quantum mechanics, quantum physics. What they're trying to do is they're trying to influence what's called the luck plane to tip in their favor. Now, this luck plane, which may or may not exist, but think about the luck plane as like a flat surface with a marble in the center. And what they're attempting to do is tip the plane so that the marble rolls toward them. So they're trying to shift luck. I want you to take a listen to this clip from the Lex Fridman podcast. And on this episode, he has Richard Spence, who is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Idaho and a recognized expert in espionage, secret societies, the occult, and modern Russian military history. He is known for investigating hidden history, focusing on figures like spy Sidney Riley and occultist Aleister Crowley, and he has contributed to several documentaries on the History Channel. Take a listen.
The most interesting statement about, and a key element of this becomes the thing called magic. Now, we all know magic, it's a guy standing on stage performing a trick. But the interesting thing about a stage magician is that a stage magician is, we know when we're watching this that it's a trick. Yet we can't really figure out, if he does it well, how that trick is being accomplished because it seems to defy physical laws. And that's what's fascinating about it. So even though you know it's a trick, if you can't figure it out, it has this kind of power of fascination. But it's mimicking something. Stage magic is mimicking real magic. So it's real magic. Well, let's go back to Aleister Crowley because, he always has to come. I knew he was going to come up at some point in this earlier than that because he always does.
All roads lead to Aleister Crowley.
All roads lead to Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley, and I've said this enough that I should be able to get it right, but I'm paraphrasing here. He goes, magic, which of course he spelled with a K or CK, is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. So in a way that's sort of mind over matter, but it's the idea that one can, through will, through intention, bend reality to make something happen. Somebody once put it this way, it's tipping the luck plane. And so, you got some kind of a level plane. What we're trying to do is just tip it just a little bit so the marble rolls over one side or another. Now, that presupposes a lot of things. That is there a luck plane? I don't know. But, it's a good sort of idea to have. And here again, don't become overly bothered trying to figure out whether you actually can bend reality. Become bothered by the fact that there are people who believe that they can and will go to great efforts to do so and will often believe they have succeeded. So it's this effort to make things occur in a particular way, maybe just to sort of nudge reality in one little way or another. And that's where things like rituals come in. Rituals are a way of focusing will and attention. We're all there. We're all thinking about the same thing. And you have to imagine just how, the pervasiveness of what could be called that kind of magical thinking every day is everywhere. So let me give you an example. You ever attended a high school football pep rally?
Mm-hmm.
Think of what's going on there. Okay, your team is going to battle the other team. You've now assembled everyone in the gymnasium. You've got people who are dancing around in animal totem costumes. And what are you chanting? Everyone is supposed to chant that, that the other team dies, okay, that you'll be horribly defeated and that our team will be victorious. That is a magic ritual. The idea is, it becomes into this idea that's very popular today about visualizing things. Visualizing, manifesting. I love this term. You need to manifest your success. Well, that's just magic. That is trying to cause change in conformity with will. So these things can happen without you being even consciously aware of what's going on. And you don't need to be, because if you're all a part of the mob, which is there in the gymnasium, and you get into this and you get worked up, an occultist would argue what you're doing is you're creating a huge amount of energy. All of these people are putting energy into something, and that energy goes somewhere. And maybe you can, just maybe, you actually can slightly increase the chances of your team's victory. Of course, your opponents are having their own ritual at the same time, so whoever has the bigger mojo will apparently win on the team.
So that's I would say, trivial example of that, but a clear one.
So as we heard we heard him talking about luck. Quantum physics suggests that luck may not be pure randomness, but rather outcomes influenced by underlying probabilities, observer effects, and interconnected patterns. While not predicting fate, quantum mechanics implies that conscious observation and focus can influence probabilistic outcomes. So this perspective challenges the notion of blind chance and actually suggests a hidden order in favorable events. These elite, this ruling class, they believe they can bend reality, they can tip the luck plane to gain money and power. This is their version of manifesting and visualizing, and they are using rituals to help push that luck in their favor. But think about what they're looking for. They want money, wealth, power. God doesn't really work, but these ancient figures, Baal and Moloch, they're the perfect metaphors for our economic and political system demands today. Moloch provides what God doesn't. Moloch is the God who says, give me your children, give me your future, burn them in the fire so I can bless you with safety and prosperity. Think about that and look around. Children are sacrificed to war so defense stocks can soar. Children are sacrificed to poverty and austerity so bond markets can stay calm. Children are sacrificed to environmental collapse so fossil fuel profits can run a few more quarters. And in the darkest corners, children sacrificed literally through trafficking, abuse, and in some cases, ritualized violence that looks a lot like the old myths. From that angle, Baal and Moloch are not just spooky names. They're the true patron saints of late capitalism. The billionaires at the top of this system may not believe in Moloch as a literal deity, again, but the release of the Epstein files and Epstein naming one of his bank accounts Baal suggests that some actually do. But either way, their behavior really tells us what they do believe in. Endless growth, no matter the human cost, a world where everything and everyone is for sale, a hierarchy where those at the top get to decide who is disposable. The occasional use of occult or satanic symbolism like the owl statues, secret groves, weird art on the walls of some of their mansions, those function as like winks to the insiders. They're saying, we know exactly what we're doing. We know this is a cult of sacrifice, and we're in on the joke. This is why the language of mythology and ritual is so useful. It just helps us name something that otherwise looks like random horror. A system that devours children, both metaphorically and literally, and a class of people who have convinced themselves that this is just the cost of doing business. Now, before I start sounding too much like a tin hat, I'm not trying to be like the next Alex Jones or Candace Owens. I also want to look at it from the psychology perspective. Okay, so occult behaviors and rituals aside, there's also a psychological explanation for what's happening here. So I want to discuss that too. But before we do that, we have to acknowledge that both money and power are a powerful shield, and these elites have the freedom to live out their demented fantasies because they have this shield protecting them. Another thing to note, power changes people. There was an infamous 1971 Stanford University experiment that showed the extent of behavior changes when in uniform. Philip Zimbardo and colleagues built a mock prison in the basement of Stanford University Psychology Department. Each participant was randomly assigned to play a guard or a prisoner. Guards dressed like guards and were given whistles, whereas prisoners dressed like prisoners with identification numbers stamped on their smocks. The initial plan was to observe students for 2 weeks, but the study had to terminate in 6 days. The guards became aggressive, insulting, and humiliating, whereas the prisoners became passive, helpless, and emotionally disturbed. So it showed us a lot about how power can change a person. But also, according to Dr. Elizabeth Siegel, who wrote an article in Psychology Today, there's a lot of research that backs this, power also blocks empathy. So the more power people acquire, the less empathetic they are towards people who are not equal to them. They lose empathy. You see this a lot in leadership, CEOs. The higher up they go, the further away they get from the people, and they lose that empathy. And at some point, everyone becomes disposable. And for some people, this is why they enjoy harming innocent and vulnerable children, because they see people as disposable when they're not equal to them. They can harm them because they know they can. They know they can get away with it. I want to talk about what's called the Dark Triad of personality. These are 3 malevolent personality traits that exist that all of us embody on some level, but people who are high in all 3 consistently would be considered evil. And so the 3 traits of the Dark Triad are narcissism, so an inflated sense of self-importance, deep need for admiration, and a notable lack of empathy for others. Fun fact, Donald Trump is actually highest in this one. A bunch of psychologists, but based on his behaviors, found him to be the highest in narcissism. He's actually high in all 3. Then we have Machiavellianism, which is more like a cold strategic approach to relationships and power. Machiavellian individuals view people as tools for personal gain. So the ends justify the means, and they excel at manipulating people. And the third one is psychopathy. So this combines superficial charm with ruthlessness. Psychopathic traits include things like impulsivity, lack of remorse, refusal to take responsibility for mistakes, and a tendency to blame others for failures. One study actually showed that Donald Trump scored higher in psychopathy than Adolf Hitler. So just something to think about. Again, we all embody these. Men do experience them more than women, which would also track when you look at the ratio between men and women and the offender, perpetrators, and victims in the Epstein files. But somebody who embodies all 3 of these consistently would be considered evil. And people who are high in the Dark Triad, they only want one thing: power. The ability to influence things and get what they want, because they only care about themselves. So they will do anything to seek power. Now, once they get power and they're in power, they may also experience what is called hubris syndrome. So this is known as more like an acquired personality disorder or even a behavioral syndrome that affects individuals who are already in power. This is often, typically like politicians, CEOs. It's characterized by excessive pride, overconfidence, contempt for others, and a detachment from reality. Triggered by sustained, successful, and unchecked power, it causes leaders to become reckless, ignore advice, and believe that they are infallible. And all of this is related to power. They see themselves as the elite, and it is so intoxicating that they will do anything to keep that power because it lets them do what they want without facing the consequences. This episode actually reminded me of a quote. It's not exactly tied to this, but I remember this quote that came up that said, 50 Shades of Grey is only romantic because he's a billionaire. If he lived in a trailer park, it would be an episode of Criminal Minds. And I thought that's exactly what money and power does. Same behaviors, but one provides a cushion and one does not. So to make this concrete, we need to look at some specific cases where these patterns show up. So I want us to look at a couple of real examples. So as I was doing my research for this episode, one of the fascinating things that I found, this part is kind of obvious, but Epstein was not the first of his kind to be associated with the occult, with rituals, with sex trafficking. I want to start with another story that happened before Epstein. So I want to start with the Franklin Credit Union scandal. It was centered around a man named Lawrence E. King Jr. in the 1980s in Nebraska. Without diving into every twist and turn, here's the short version. Lawrence King was a rising Republican figure and a manager at the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. In the late 80s, allegations surfaced that he was at the center of a network involving child abuse, trafficking, and parties with powerful men. Some witnesses described scenes that had ritualized elements. They weren't always explicitly satanic, but they were filled with power symbolism, costumes, and deliberate humiliation. A state legislator-appointed committee began investigating, and a grand jury was convened. What followed was classic institutional self-protection. The scandal was narrowed down to just financial crimes. Witnesses who spoke about abuse found themselves discredited, threatened, or prosecuted. And some mysteriously died. Documents went missing, leads were dropped, and the wider network was never fully exposed. If you want to learn more, I will have the link to the full episode in the description of this episode, and it'll also be in my Patreon where I will recap this episode. But now let's fast forward to Jeffrey Epstein. Again, a man deeply plugged into money, politics, and intelligence-adjacent circles. Again, a pattern of trafficking vulnerable young people and children for the use of powerful clients. Again, a trail of witness intimidation, sweetheart deals, and institutional stonewalling. And again, hints and fragments of ritualized elements, themed parties, staged scenarios, and an atmosphere of you're in a different moral universe now. The locations and the names are different, but the patterns all rhyme. Vulnerable children and teens are recruited, often out of poverty, foster care, or unstable homes. They're brought into spaces controlled by wealthy, well-connected adults. The abuse is not a one-off crime, but a repeatable industrial process. When survivors speak, they run into a wall of denial backed by money and institutions. Do we have a perfect courtroom-ready map of every ritual, every symbol, every act? No. But we have enough to see the contours of something that looks like a modern cult of Moloch. Children treated as disposable offerings. Elites bound together by shared guilt and shared secrets. A media and political class that at best looks the other way and at worst actively helps bury the evidence. And this is the point where mythology and politics collide. So let's pull all the threads together. We start with Baal and Moloch, gods of sacrifice and fire, demanding that people put their children into the flames in exchange for safety and prosperity. We followed those archetypes through history into the courts, secret societies of the powerful, and even to the modern language of Satanism and ritual. We looked at satanic ritual abuse not as a cartoon about red devils, but as a realistic technology of blackmail and control, where taboo acts are used to bind people to a network. We talked about Epstein not as an isolated freak incident, but as a glimpse into how these networks operate, recruiting the vulnerable, compromising the powerful, and relying on institutions to look away. We connected all of that back to the core question. Why do our ruling classes keep returning to the logic of Baal and Moloch, to the idea that many, and especially children, can be sacrificed so the few can feel safe, rich, and untouchable? Here's my answer. Because they've built an economic and political system that already runs on sacrifice. Sacrifice the poor. Sacrifice the planet. Sacrifice the bodies of workers and soldiers. Sacrifice children to poverty, to pollution, to war, and in the darkest rooms, to literal trafficking and ritualized violence. Once you've accepted that logic in the abstract, it's not a huge leap for the most corrupted among them to start acting it out in the most obscene ways possible. So what do we do with that? First, we have to refuse to look away. We have to listen to the survivors. We need to follow the money and the paper trails. We treat patterns like Franklin, like Epstein, as signals to dig deeper, not as one-off anomalies. Second, we refuse the cult of Moloch in our own lives and politics. We stop accepting arguments that say some people must be sacrificed for the economy. We demand systems that treat children and the vulnerable as sacred, not collateral. And we organize for a world where care, not sacrifice, is the organizing principle. And finally, we learn to read the symbols. When you see the elites surrounding themselves with occult imagery, grotesque art, or jokes about suffering, believe them when they tell you who they are. When you see policies that quietly sacrifice millions of lives for shareholder value, understand that this is just another altar to the same old God. Baal and Moloch never really left. They just put on suits, bought media companies, and started funding think tanks. Our job is not to panic, not to build our own superstition, but to name what's happening and to organize against it politically, economically, and culturally. And then we need to come together, crash the fucking system, and topple these sick fucks out of power. And then I want to leave you with a question before we close out. What kind of society eats its children? Thank you for joining me. I will see you in the next episode.